Hey guys, tonight, we're going to a place where time doesn't just pass, it chimes. Imagine yourself in a dim stone room not much wider than your arms. The air smells faintly of old wood-damp limestone and beeswax. You're wrapped in a coarse wool robe that scratches in all the wrong places, and your bed is, well, technically, it's a plank. You've got a single blanket that's heavy enough to double as a medieval security system. But sleep doesn't last long here, not when your day starts hours before sunrise. Suddenly, a distant bell rings out in the stillness. 1, 2, 3 soft tolls. You groan, not just because it's cold, but because this is your life now. You live by the bell, and you'd better not be late. Not for matins, not for prime, not for any of the 8 canonical hours monks observed. You shuffle out into the corridor, your bare feet flinching at each icy flagstone tile. You pass a narrow window slit outside, it's pitch black. The stars are the only things awake, and they're judging you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing who's tuning in from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the chapel, led by nothing but candlelight and the faint memory of yesterday's routine. You can't tell if it's 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. The sky doesn't care. You just know the bell rang, and when the bell rings, the body follows. It's an odd thing, this monastic life, no clocks on the wall, no phone in your hand, no beeping reminders. And yet somehow, they always know when to wake up. Well, almost always. You pass Brother Thomas in the hall, his head bobbing sleepily. He mutters something about the bell ringing late today. Brother Andrew disagrees. They glance up at the chapel clock, which is nothing but a painted sundial. Useless at night. There's some grumbling about the bell ringer being off his game. Again, see, in this world, time is sacred. Literally. Your prayers, your meals, your work, even your naps are structured down to the breath. But how do you keep time without, well, a clock? That's the curious thing about medieval monasteries. They invented the systems that eventually became clocks, not because they were obsessed with punctuality, but because their spiritual lives depended on it. Back in the day, if you missed matins, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was a sign of laziness, possibly even moral failure. You're here to devote every moment to God. Every moment you oversleep, a tiny scrap of your soul sighs in disappointment. So monks got creative. If your soul's at stake, you don't just rely on your own sleepy brain to wake you, you build a system. And that system at first was other people. The first real alarm clocks weren't mechanical at all. They were Brother Geoffrey, with a bell walking through the halls at unholy hours with a lantern and a sheepish apology. That poor guy was the designated human alarm no snooze button, but plenty of resentment. And if he overslept, oh boy. It's a spiritual chain reaction of tardiness, but even Geoffrey needs a Geoffrey. So how did he know when to ring the bell? Here's where it gets fun. You see, monks started experimenting with different kinds of timekeepers. The simplest ones, your own body. After a few months of the same schedule, you kind of develop an internal clock, kind of. You might also hallucinate a rooster speaking Latin, but we'll get to that later. Outside, some monasteries built sundials, but these were only useful during the day, and only if it wasn't cloudy, which, let's face it, in medieval Europe, was most of the time. At night, some monasteries relied on the stars, but that required someone to stay up and actually look at the stars, which was less romantic when it was freezing and raining sideways. Then came candles. Tall, measured candles marked with lines that burned down predictably. If the candle burned to line 5, you knew it was time to wake up. The problem: drafts, rats, human error. Also, they were flammable, which led to incidents like the one in St. Martin's Abbey, where a sleepy monk nodded off during his night shift. The candle tipped, and the library nearly joined the heavenly hosts in smoke form. Over time, monasteries started tinkering with water clocks. Imagine a bowl with a small hole placed in a basin of water. As the water drips in the bowl eventually fills and sinks, triggering a bell or a visual cue. Ingenious, and also wildly inconsistent, depending on the temperature, humidity, and whether the novice responsible remembered to refill it. Historians still argue whether monks borrowed this tech from ancient China, the Islamic world, or simply reinvented it. The idea of water clocks dates back millennia, but it was in monasteries that they started being used to wake people up, not just tell the time. This was new. This was radical. This was still not super reliable. So in your first week in the abbey, you don't just learn Latin psalms and how to chant in 4-part harmony. You also learn how to read a candle, how to listen for the bell, and most importantly, how not to be the one who sleeps through it, because that guy, he will get dish duty for a week. And that dear sleeper is how your humble journey into medieval monastic timekeeping begins. Bleary-eyed, barefoot, slightly cranky, and following a bell that someone else had to remember to ring. For now, you make it to the chapel just as the final echoes of the bell fade into the stone. It's dark in here, really dark. A few candles flicker by the altar, casting long, wobbly shadows on the worn stone floor. The air tastes of waxed damp wood and something faintly herbal, lavender maybe, or whatever Brother Alric added to the incense today. You file into place beside the others, your voice blending into the low hum of chanted Latin. It's too early to feel holy, but too late to pretend you didn't hear the bell. This is Matins, the first of the eight daily prayer sessions prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict, the ancient instruction manual for monastic life. You've seen it bound in worn leather sitting ominously in the scriptorium. Thin pages, thick warnings. Written in the 6th century, the rule outlines everything: when to sleep, when to pray, what to eat, and how long to spend silently contemplating the nature of temptation while peeling turnips. You're beginning to learn in here time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the divine. And the rule insists that time must be carved up into sacred moments, not wasted on idle chatter daydreams or, heaven forbid, sleeping in. There are names for each hour of worship. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none. Vespers, compline. And no, they're not Hogwarts spells though. They might as well be. Together, they form a kind of spiritual clock, a rhythm of waking, working, resting, and praying that shapes the entire day, every day, forever. It's devotion in 8 parts, and missing one is like skipping a stair in the dark. You feel it. Everyone notices, and you're probably going to trip. The idea behind this rigid schedule was noble. Even beautiful, turn your entire day into a prayer. But in practice, it meant someone had to know when all these hours were happening. Someone had to keep track. And that someone was usually a monk with no training in astronomy, timekeeping, or engineering. Just one poor guy trying to figure out whether dawn had started based on how many owls were still hooting outside. This led to some inconsistencies. You hear whispered stories. How one abbey's matins always started 30 minutes early because their bell ringer was just really nervous. Or how another forgot lauds altogether one Thursday and blamed it on unusually persistent fog. There's the tale of Brother Wilhelm, who used the angle of moss on a rock to tell time until a goat ate the moss and made him an hour late. That goat is now apparently a local legend because the rule was non-negotiable. Monasteries began putting their best minds, not just their most punctual monks, on the problem. How do you make a schedule sacred and sustainable? How do you make sure someone doesn't just roll over and pretend they didn't hear the bell? You begin to realize that monasticism wasn't just a spiritual pursuit. It was a logistical marvel. These communities didn't just preserve books and chant psalms. They invented systems to keep life running on divine time. They turned time itself into a spiritual practice. And it had to be enforced. Enforced how? Well, remember the rule. It comes with consequences. Mild infractions earned you silence at meals. Not as peaceful as it sounds when you're trying to chew barley stew quietly. Worse infractions might mean extra chores, public apology during chapter meetings, or being demoted from script copying to sheep counting, a real downgrade unless you really liked sheep. But the worst part, disappointing the community. Everyone relied on everyone else to keep the rhythm. If one person failed to show up for prayer, the whole harmony was off. That pressure, gentle but ever-present, was often enough to keep you on your toes. Still, monks are human. They overslept. They faked stomach aches. They hid in the root cellar. And because of this, abbeys doubled down. If guilt couldn't wake you, maybe a bell could. This is where we start to see something fascinating. The institutionalization of time. Most people in medieval Europe lived by the sun. Farmers rose when it was light and stopped when it got dark. Time was flexible, vague. You planted by the season, not by the hour. But monks were different. They needed precise intervals to serve a god who frankly had high standards for punctuality. And because of that, monasteries became centers of early timekeeping. They weren't just building spiritual discipline, they were laying the groundwork for the modern clock. And they did it not out of scientific curiosity, but because they were tired of Brother Stephen falling asleep during Compline and snoring through the Psalms. Historians still argue whether the earliest mechanical clocks came because of monastic need or whether they were simply adopted there first. What we do know is that these cloistered communities were the first to care deeply enough about regularity to demand such devices. So here you are, standing in the shadow of candlelight, chanting ancient hymns, not knowing if it's 3:30 or 4 a.m., but knowing somehow that it's time. Not because of a wristwatch, not because of a phone, but because an ancient rhythm is humming underneath everything held together by rules, bells, guilt, and possibly a goat. And as the final prayer fades into silence, you glance over at Brother Matthew, the current bell ringer. His eyes are half closed, his head dipping forward. You watch him sway a little, just a little too far. Then clink his forehead gently meets the stone column in front of him. Not hard enough to hurt, just enough to wake him up. He blinks, nods, and pretends nothing happened. We've all been there. By now, you've memorized the floor pattern of the abbey halls. Cold stone, faintly damp, with a few tiles that are chipped just enough to stub your toe if you aren't careful, especially at ungodly hours. You shuffle along them now, heading back to your cell after matins. The candle in your hand flickers as you pass through a drafty archway, and you briefly wonder if this counts as cardio. It's still dark. Of course it is. You've only completed one of 8 prayer sessions, and the sun hasn't even clocked in yet. Back in your cell, you have just enough time to lie down and almost fall asleep before the next bell rings. That's the rhythm. Pray, nap, pray again, maybe work a little, then nap again. It's like divine interval training. This is where the real war begins, not against sin or temptation, but against time itself. Monks didn't just observe time. They tried to tame it. And without reliable clocks, that meant building systems, however weird, wet, or waxy, to track its passage. You might not have a minute hand, but by heaven, you'll know when terce begins. Your first clue that monks were getting creative. The sundials, simple enough in theory, a stick in the ground casting a shadow on a marked surface. But monks weren't content with one big sundial in the courtyard. Oh no, they wanted accuracy. You'd find dozens of them all over monastic complexes, vertical ones on south-facing walls, horizontal ones in gardens, even portable versions carved into wood or bone. Some were so elaborate, they had multiple dials for different seasons, and one even included zodiac signs for reasons still not fully understood. Possibly astrology. Possibly a prank. but sundials only work during daylight. And if you've ever experienced a European winter, you know sunlight is more suggestion than guarantee. So monks turn to more experimental methods. Enter the candle clock. Imagine this, a tall candle, carefully crafted with evenly spaced lines carved down the side. As the candle burned, each line marked a fixed amount of time, maybe 15 or 30 minutes. Set it beside your bed, and when the wax melts down to the 6th mark, you know it's time to wake up and chant about humility. Genius, right? Until the dog knocks it over, or a draft speeds it up, or the wax composition is inconsistent, or Brother Simon falls asleep before lighting it. Candle clocks were charming but flawed. They worked in a perfectly controlled setting, which, spoiler alert, medieval monasteries were not. And yet monks used them anyway because they had to. For a while, there was even a designated candle watcher whose sole job was to make sure the time wax didn't burn too fast or too slow. A thankless job second only to the brother assigned to clean the candle holders. And even then, accidents happened. Take the famous incident in one abbey. Historians still debate whether it was York or Rouen, where a candle clock used for early morning wake-up duty tipped sideways while unattended. The wax pooled over a wooden writing desk, dripped down onto a pile of parchment, and ignited a fire that burned through half the scriptorium. Miraculously, no one was hurt. Less miraculously, they lost 12 illuminated manuscripts and one very startled novice who had been hiding in the corner skipping lauds. This incident became so well known that some abbeys banned candle clocks altogether and returned to human wake-up calls. And let's be honest, at least Brother Geoffrey wouldn't burst into flames. Still, the war against unreliable timekeeping raged on. Water clocks or clepsydras started making an appearance in more sophisticated abbeys. These were inspired by ancient designs, essentially containers that filled or emptied at a predictable rate, often used in Greece, Egypt, and Islamic civilizations. In a medieval monastic context, the clepsydra became a symbol of innovation wrapped in piety. Here's how it worked. One pot of water would slowly drip into another. When the lower vessel filled to a certain point, it would either tilt and spill, making a noise, or lift a small mechanism that triggered a bell or chime. In theory, perfectly paced. In practice, well, let's say water doesn't always cooperate. Temperature affected flow rate. Sediment clogged the holes. The materials expanded and contracted. And famously, one abbey's clepsydra was built by a monk with zero plumbing skills, resulting in a timepiece that was only accurate when nobody touched it, sneezed near it, or walked too loudly within 5 meters. And yet monks persisted, because they weren't just trying to keep time, they were trying to make time sacred. Every drip of water, every inch of wax, these weren't just tools, they were offerings. Every device had a devotional purpose to ensure that no moment of praise was missed, no hour unsanctified. Historians still argue whether the monasteries developed these clocks independently or borrowed heavily from Arabic and Byzantine designs. There's evidence of knowledge exchange. Traveling scholars translated texts and artifacts carried through trade routes. Whatever the source, what matters is the why. Unlike court astronomers or philosophers, monks weren't pursuing curiosity. They were pursuing obedience. You, for example, are already learning to trust these imperfect instruments. You glance at the stub of your candle before you rest. You listen for the telltale drip of the clepsydra from the hallway. You whisper a quick prayer, half thankful, half exhausted, and lie down for what will be at best 90 minutes of rest. Because soon enough, someone or something will call you back to the chapel. And if it's Brother Geoffrey again, you swear you're going to hide in the root cellar next time. You barely close your eyes before the next bell tolls low, slow, and deeply committed to its own echo. It rolls through the monastery like a reminder from the heavens. Time waits for no monk. Your muscles groan in protest. Your eyes feel glued shut. But up you get, muttering a half-hearted hymn under your breath as you shuffle back into the corridor. This time you pass by a corridor filled with the scent of beeswax and ash. There's a pile of charred candle stubs near a small workbench. Nearby, Brother Evo is hunched over a new project, his sleeves pushed up, wax clinging to his fingers. He's carving grooves into another batch of time candles, and judging by the burn marks on the wall behind him, his last batch left a bit of a dramatic impression. Yes, this is the age of the candle clock, and it is, in a word, experimental. Monks loved these things, not because they were particularly accurate, but because they were one of the few tools they could make themselves. You didn't need a traveling craftsman or exotic imports. Just wax a mold, a wick, and a very, very steady hand. Most candle clocks stood about 12 inches tall and were marked in increments that burned at regular intervals. The clever part: you could insert pins at specific marks. When the wax melted past one of those pins, it would fall into a metal tray with a ping waking up the sleeper. Medieval alarm system achieved, and yet the variables were endless. A cold room made the wax burn slower. A draft made it flare and vanish too soon. Some monks swore that beeswax burned more consistently than tallow. Others insisted it was all about wick thickness. It wasn't uncommon to find a group of monks standing around a candle arguing quietly about melt ratios, like it was a sacred science experiment. One particularly enthusiastic monk, Brother Peter of Glastonbury, kept a detailed notebook of his candle trials. Modern historians love him for it. His notes include lines like 7 marks, 1 hour 22 minutes, wind from east Brother A sneezed twice. Truly, the spirit of scientific observation, with a dash of medieval flair. Of course, all this trial and error came with hazards. Fires were surprisingly common. Candles left unattended during nap hours ignited curtains, manuscripts, and once, disastrously, a basket of drying herbs that smoked out the infirmary. One abbey's attempt to use a multi-wick candle clock meant to speed up the burn rate for shorter intervals ended in what can only be described as a wax explosion. And then there were the improvisations. One novice, desperate to create a more reliable system, glued thin slivers of tin onto his candle so they'd drop into a ceramic bowl more audibly. Clever. Unfortunately, the sound was loud enough to wake the entire dormitory and scare a barn owl roosting in the rafters, which then dive-bombed the novice in retaliation. The owl won. The clock was banned. Even so, the candle remained a symbol of progress. For many monasteries, it was the first real step toward time automation, a move from human-dependent wake-up calls to something approaching self-regulation. And in a community where time was divine, that meant something. Still, not everyone trusted the candles. Elder monks, skeptical of technology, preferred the old ways. They saw the candle clock as lazy, an excuse not to rise by instinct and devotion. One famously grumbled, "If you cannot hear the voice of God in the silence before dawn, you do not need a candle. You need more humility." He was later found sleeping through prime 3 days in a row. But there were others, pragmatists mostly, who believed in refining the sacred process. If a bit of wax could help you rise in time to sing praises, why not use it? God gave us bees, did he? Not one monk shrugged while replacing a stub. Historians still argue whether these candle clocks were standardized across Europe or developed independently at various abbeys. Some claim a network of monastic correspondence helped share successful designs. Others point to regional quirks, a German abbey that used sand instead of wax, an Italian one that painted hours directly onto stained glass windows, depending on how the light filtered through. One thing certain, monks were obsessed with fixing time in place, not just in their prayers, but in their bodies, in their tools, even in the shadows that flickered on the chapel walls. Time was not something to be measured casually. It was to be obeyed, honored, marked. And if that meant a few accidental fires or owl-related injuries, well, so be it. Tonight you sleep again with one of these stubby time candles burning beside your bed. It's new, fresh, carefully calibrated by Brother Evo himself. You've placed a little copper pin at the 4th notch. When the wax melts just enough to release it, it should drop and land in your brass bowl with a satisfying ting. That's your cue to rise. As you lie back down, you stare at the dancing flame. It's hypnotic, soft, steady. You know it might betray you, burn too fast or too slow. But in this moment, it feels reliable, almost like a friend. You drift off trusting wax and wick to carry you back to the chapel. At least until a sudden gust sneaks under the door, and the flame flutters dangerously sideways. You may need a backup bell after all. You wake with a start. The copper pin never dropped. Instead, your eyes open to a faint scent of burned wax and a curl of smoke rising from the stubby candle. Now, just a sad puddle beside the bowl. No sound, no ting, just silence, and the undeniable feeling that you're very late for something. You scramble to your feet, yank on your robe, and shuffle out into the corridor, still half asleep. A few other monks pass by with the serene expressions of those who are definitely on time. One glances at you and smiles faintly sympathetically. He knows. Your candle clock failed, again. But this isn't the end of the line for monastic timekeeping. It's the start of something better. You just don't know it yet. Because not long from now, a few brilliant and possibly sleep-deprived monks are going to get tired of missed bells, smouldering wax and sneezing owls, and begin work on a new kind of solution. A dry, mechanical, gloriously predictable one. You pass the refectory and notice something different. A group of monks huddled around a table, not for prayers or porridge, but to examine a wooden box with gears, levers, and what appears to be a bell inside. Brother Conrad is turning a crank, while Brother Hugo holds a wax tablet and scratches notes furiously. It's the earliest prototype of a mechanical alarm clock, and it's as exciting as anything you've seen since you entered the monastery. It all started with gears. The knowledge of gears and mechanisms didn't originate in the abbey, of course. It came from a long tradition dating back to ancient Greek engineers like Hero of Alexandria, and later refined by Islamic scholars who created intricate astronomical devices. But the application of that knowledge in a monastic setting, that was a monk specialty, and it made perfect sense. Who needed precise regular intervals more than monks who had both the motivation and the time to tinker endlessly with gears, pulleys and escapements? And perhaps most importantly, who had the guilt-based perseverance to keep trying, even after their device scared the abbot. The earliest mechanical clocks in monasteries weren't exactly portable. Some took up entire rooms. They ticked, sometimes talked rarely, and made sounds that ranged from musical chimes to terrifying mechanical grunts. But they were consistent. At least more consistent than a burning candle on a wobbly nightstand. These clocks often had weight-driven mechanisms using gravity to move a series of gears that turned hands or activated levers. When enough tension built up, it released and ding, you had your signal. Some even had automated bells. Real working don't require Jeffrey bells. It was revolutionary. Of course, they didn't look like clocks yet. There were no faces or hour hands. Instead, they were sound-based. They marked when something happened, not what time it was. In a world where its time for terse mattered more than it's exactly 9:15, this was perfectly logical. And so, in a few forward-thinking monasteries, likely in places like England, France and Italy, you began to see bell towers outfitted with these newfangled devices. A hanging weight slowly lowered through the day. At certain intervals it tripped a mechanism that rang a bell, loudly, repeatedly, and often with enough enthusiasm to wake the entire community. One early model was so loud that it startled a passing merchant's horse into bolting through the abbey garden, trampling 3 rows of carefully cultivated onions. Brother Basil never quite forgave the inventor. But the bells rang on time, and that was the point. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a monk in northern Germany who, after sleeping through prime 3 mornings in a row, declared, "If God wishes me to rise, he will surely ring a bell." A week later, he unveiled a crude alarm device involving a water wheel, a lead weight, and a rotating wooden rooster that pecked a triangle bell at dawn. It didn't last, but it got people talking. Historians still argue whether these mechanical clocks were created for the bells or whether the bells were just a happy consequence of clock development. But what's clear is that monasteries became the incubators of this technology. Quiet, methodical spaces where the value of precise timekeeping was never in question. Eventually, some monasteries became known not just for their scriptoria or their libraries, but for their clock towers. Visitors would stop to marvel. Artisans were invited to observe, to improve, to borrow. Over time, the secrets of monastic clocks leaked out into the world beyond the cloister. But here in the dim corridors of your own abbey, it still feels like magic. You return to your cell after breakfast, where your failed candle clock sits beside the window, a melted lump of ambition. You glance at it with mild betrayal. Then at the faint whirring you hear echoing from the bell tower, you smile. Something new is coming. Something that ticks chimes and doesn't rely on wax or water or hopeful estimation. It's still in its early days, clunky, temperamental, a bit of a diva, but it works. And for a monastery that runs on sacred intervals, that's all that matters. You lie down again just for a moment and close your eyes. Somewhere above gears begin to turn. You don't get to sleep this time either. A sharp clang, metallic, deliberate, with the subtle confidence of a bell that knows it's winning, pulls you from your not-quite slumber. You blink, groan, and sit up just in time to hear it ring again. 3 times evenly spaced. You mutter under your breath, "That's not Geoffrey." No, it isn't. Geoffrey, the long-suffering bell ringer, has just been replaced not by another monk, but by a mechanism. A gear-driven, weight-loaded, early-stage alarm system with absolutely no sympathy for your sleep schedule. You throw on your robe and join the shuffle of sleepy monks heading toward the chapel again. But there's a new buzz, quiet, reverent, but unmistakable. Everyone's talking about the clock, because this morning the bell rang on time. Without human error, without sleepy delays, without Brother Geoffrey accidentally tripping over his robe and knocking over the lantern again. This time it rang because a machine made it ring. A marvel, a miracle, a very noisy step into the future. This is the rise of the monastic clock tower, a grand structure often tall and visible from miles around, where time was literally cranked into being. These towers were more than architectural showpieces. They were technological shrines to divine order. In some places, they were downright elaborate. Take the Abbey in Dunstable, England, historically credited with having one of the earliest public mechanical clocks around 1283. Not content with just ringing bells, monks there devised automata, little figures that moved when the clock struck. Imagine a solemn wooden monk hammering his bell at vespers, while another turned to nod piously toward the sanctuary. Was it creepy? A little. But it worked, and it wasn't just about spectacle. These automations were teaching tools, visual cues, and sacred reminders of time's relentless and holy march forward. Back in your own abbey, the tower project has reached fever pitch. Brother Conrad, the unofficial clock monk, hasn't slept a full night in weeks. He's greased every cog, filed every gear tooth, and spent at least one full day locked inside the tower after the counterweight jammed and blocked the stairs. He was found the next morning meditating, or possibly sulking. No one's sure. You make your way past the scriptorium, where Brother Hugo has scribbled rough diagrams of the mechanism on the back of a hymnal. A big no-no, but even the abbot let it slide. The diagrams show a weight hanging on a rope slowly unwinding and turning a drum. That in turn rotates a gear wheel which clicks forward with each swing of a pendulum-like arm. The result, regular motion, predictable motion, motion that makes time feel almost tangible. And when that motion meets a striker arm positioned just right, bing a bell sounds. You hear murmurs from the older monks. Some are skeptical, others are awed. One simply crosses himself every time the bell chimes, as if blessing the machine will keep it from developing opinions. Historians still argue whether these early mechanical clocks came directly from monastic inventiveness or were inspired by secular tinkering adapted for spiritual needs. But there's little doubt monks became the most obsessed with precision. Because precision wasn't just about efficiency, it was about discipline, about honoring the rule, about silencing your own ego and surrendering to a greater rhythm. You start to notice the change almost immediately. The rhythm of the abbey grows more predictable. Bells ring on the dot. Chants start exactly when they should. Meals arrive without the awkward shuffle of "is it none already?" There's a calmness, oddly enough, in letting the gears decide. And the more you trust it, the more free you feel to focus not on counting hours, but on filling them. Still, it's not all serenity and success. One night, the bell rings 10 minutes early. The novice on kitchen duty panics, overcooks the barley, and someone gets hit in the face with a ladle during the stampede for breakfast. Turns out a mouse had nested in the gear housing and jammed the weight drop. The solution? The monks build a tiny mesh screen around the drive shaft's early pest control in the name of punctuality. And then there's the volume issue. The first mechanical alarm clock in your abbey is loud. So loud it sets off a sort of existential crisis. Is waking up for lords meant to be gentle and contemplative? Or is it more effective when it sounds like a blacksmith assaulting a cathedral bell? One monk proposes tuning the bell's hammer to produce a softer tone. Another suggests wrapping it in wool. A third, probably sleep-deprived, tries to silence it by wedging a potato in the striker arm. None of these methods stick, but they do spark conversations about how one should be woken for holy duty. With clarity, with force, or with a gradual easing of light and sound, like dawn creeping in through stained glass. You start to see that the invention of the mechanical bell is more than just a practical shift. It's philosophical. Monks begin discussing not just when to wake, but why. The bells are no longer just reminders. They are ritual sounds woven into the fabric of worship. And once they're mechanical, they feel unchangeable, authoritative, almost divine. One evening, after Vespers, you climb the tower for the first time. The gears click slowly in the quiet. A low, steady tick echoes in the chamber like a heartbeat. You watch as the weight descends minute by minute. You realize something: this machine, with all its brass and wood and oddly tuned clankings, is the new heartbeat of the abbey. You still rise for prayer, still kneel on cold stone, still chant until your throat is raw. But now you do it all with the comforting knowledge that somewhere above gears are turning. Bell is waiting. Time is being kept not by accident or guesswork, but by invention, devotion, and a tiny, relentless mechanism that won't let you sleep in. And honestly, you respect that. You've stopped checking the sky. That's the biggest change. Where once you squinted at stars or traced the sun's passage through narrow windows, you now listen. You trust the sound. The clock bell chimes and you move. Not because you're watching for it, but because now your whole body expects it. The rhythm has sunk deep into your bones. This is what happens when time becomes mechanical. It becomes muscle memory. The abbey is humming, not just with chants and prayers, but with a newfound steadiness. The mechanical bell tower rings at prime, at terce, at sext. It doesn't hesitate, doesn't forget, doesn't fall asleep and spill candle wax on the hymnals. It simply rings, every single time. You pass by Brother Conrad in the refectory. His eyes red, hands ink-stained, sleeves dusty with gear filings. He hasn't spoken much lately, which is always worrying. But today he looks triumphant. The latest adjustment has stabilized the escapement wheel. The bell now chimes within 10 seconds of its scheduled strike. For a 13th century monastery, that's basically atomic clock territory. You congratulate him. He nods, then promptly falls asleep with his face in a bowl of lentils. The community doesn't mock him. They understand. Because this isn't just about making mornings less chaotic. This is part of a larger shift in how monastic life is shaped. What once required constant vigilance, estimation, and improvisation is now quite literally clockwork. This frees up energy, not physical energy. You're still hauling barrels of salted fish twice a week, but mental space. The monks are less anxious about timing prayers, meals, and tasks. There's less finger counting and sun gazing. And that opens the door to deeper focus on copying texts, illuminating manuscripts, brewing medicinal herbs, and composing psalms in minor keys that always seem a little too sad for breakfast. The effects ripple outward. You start to notice that even the youngest novices who used to fumble through the day with vague confusion now move with more confidence. They anticipate the bells. They pace their chores. They arrive at Compline just as the final echoes of sunset light fade through the stained glass. There's talk of adding a second bell, a smaller one for internal signals. The larger bell is for the whole abbey, but a smaller one mounted near the dormitory or scriptorium could mark shifts in work, rest, and reflection. No more relying on a weary brother to shout sext across the garden. Now the machine will whisper it for you. This is how scheduled time begins to evolve into segmented time. Historians look back at this moment and see a turning point. Time becomes not just sacred, it becomes structured, divided, owned. The monastic day starts looking less like a fluid devotion to God and more like a series of coordinated modules. Work hour, rest hour, copy hour, bell hour, repeat. And with segmentation comes something else: efficiency. Scribes are finishing pages faster. Gardeners are rotating crops on time. The kitchen somehow stopped burning the stew. A new composting system blessed by the abbot has been timed precisely to fermentation cycles, thanks to Brother Aidan's complex chart of when to stir and when to not. You chuckle remembering the chaos before the clock. Meals eaten cold, prayers begun halfway through the designated hour. The time Brother Stephen overslept so dramatically, he arrived at Vespers in his bedrobe holding a chicken under one arm and muttering something about visions of St. Lawrence. Not anymore. Even the abbey's guests, travelling nobles, pilgrims, and the occasional bishop begin to remark on the clock. Marvellous device, one says. You can feel the order. And he's right. There's something soothing about it. The slow, steady tick from the tower, the punctual chime, the certainty that someone somewhere has already wound the weights and checked the gears. But there's a downside too. You start to notice how unforgiving the clock can be. It doesn't care if you're sick, sore, or emotionally wrecked from a dream about giant talking hedgehogs. When it rings, and you move. The human bell ringers at least used to read the room. They'd delay the bell if the abbot was deep in prayer. They'd knock gently if someone looked feverish. They'd stall an hour if a snowstorm made walking to the chapel a death sport. The clock nope. It's equal opportunity obnoxious. One night, during a thunderstorm so fierce, it rattles the stained glass windows. The bell rings right on time. Prime. 5 a.m. Rain is sideways. Wind is howling. Everyone pretends not to hear it. It rings again, louder. Eventually, the abbot groans, gets up and mutters, "We may have created a monster." You laugh quietly because laughter isn't exactly encouraged before lords. But you know what he means. In perfecting the schedule, you've surrendered a little flexibility, a little humanity. Historians still debate whether this shift toward mechanized timekeeping helped or hindered the soul. Did it lead monks toward greater discipline, or did it start chaining them to machines instead of mysteries? There's no simple answer, but standing now at the foot of the tower, listening to the gears wind down, you sense something deeper. The clock doesn't diminish your devotion, it reveals it. Without the burden of guessing, you're free to practice presence, to offer your attention, your breath, your chant fully and without hurry, because you're no longer watching the sun or checking your candle stub. You're simply here, on time. Always, the bell tolls, you smile, not because you're ready, but because you know what comes next. You don't even flinch when the bell rings anymore. That might be the most telling sign. The sharp clang that once startled you awake now feels like part of your body's rhythm, like a heartbeat from somewhere above the rafters. It echoes through the cloister walls, across the garden paths, even down into the damp cellar, where Brother Thomas tends the turnips with a devotion that borders on theological. Life in the abbey has become synchronized, and not just in the obvious ways. Sure, everyone gets up at the same time, prays at the same time, eats porridge at the same time. But there's a deeper harmony too, an invisible thread running from gear to bell to heart to hymn. It's hard to explain, but you feel it. As if now that the clocks are handling the mechanics of time, the monks are finally free to explore its meaning. This is where the real transformation happens, because once your abbey had a working mechanical clock, the idea didn't stay contained to just prayer bells. Slowly, carefully, timekeeping began to touch everything. The brothers in the infirmary started measuring medicine doses in hours rather than guesses. The kitchen scheduled its baking windows so bread stopped emerging as either rock or goo. The scriptorium timed ink drying with a little bell. Even the beeswax candles were now poured to match consistent burn rates, a full loop back to where this all began. You begin to see that the clock hasn't just helped you wake up on time, it's redefined what on time means. Before, time was tied to nature. Sunlight, shadows, animal instincts, the crow of a rooster, the shifting chill of dawn. But those things vary. They're seasonal, chaotic. A December morning isn't the same as a June one. Clouds come. Fog lingers. Roosters lie. The clock, however, it doesn't waver. It ticks, and in that ticking, monks like you found something unexpectedly profound. Freedom from uncertainty. When you trust the bell, you stop worrying about whether you're late. You stop checking the sky. You just do. And that means more mental space. More spiritual quiet. Oddly enough, it's not about control. It's about surrender. Because once you stop tracking time yourself, you allow the structure to carry you. Like joining a chant you didn't start, but suddenly find yourself in perfect harmony with. That's how the clock feels now. Like someone started a sacred rhythm, and all you had to do was fall into step. Of course not everyone adapts smoothly. Brother Felix is still struggling. A former stonemason turned monk in his later years, he finds the rigid schedule exhausting. I used to rise with the birds, he mutters. Now I rise with a machine. He's not wrong. But he's also forgetting that the birds missed Lord's 5 days out of 7. There's also a growing debate in the chapter house. Some monks argue that relying too much on mechanical precision might edge out spiritual spontaneity. What if God speaks between the bells? What if a moment of reflection blooms late or early? Does the machine allow for holy interruptions? One day, Brother Conrad, the mechanical mastermind himself, rises during the midday meal to speak. He clears his throat carefully, places a gear on the table, still oily, and says, "The bell is not the master, it is the servant. If we treat it as divine, we err. But if we treat it as a gift, we may pray even more freely, because we are no longer bound by our own forgetfulness." The abbot nods. Several monks murmur in agreement. Brother Felix grumbles something about being woken by gears, but even he doesn't object out loud. Historians still argue whether the clock accelerated monastic discipline or subtly eroded its mystical roots. Some believe it led to the eventual secularization of time, moving the world from sacred hours to punching time cards. Others argue it was a spiritual tool that gave monks what they needed: most reliability. Either way, you're living in the middle of it. And day by day, you notice something else happening. People from nearby villages start coming to see the clock. Not just nobles, now commoners. Farmers, millers, young boys with wide eyes and grubby feet asking how the bell knows when to ring. You watch as Brother Hugo explains escapements to a fisherman's daughter using pebble string and a dangerously wobbly chair. You hear the abbot explain to a visiting merchant that the clock doesn't know time, it keeps it. It marks it, shapes it, makes it audible. The merchant asks if he can build one for his shop. The abbot hesitates, then shrugs. Time is for all. And you realize the clock is no longer just for monks. It's leaking out into the world. The structure you live by is becoming a model. The monastic day, once strange and insulated, is starting to influence how other people live. When to open their stalls, when to break for meals, when to rest. The sacred rhythm is going secular, and yet you don't feel betrayed. You feel proud. Because in your small cell beneath ticking gears and humming prayers, you know this. Your little candle clocks, your water jars, your bell ropes and scraped knuckles and wax burns, they were the beginning. They were the flicker before the flame. And now that flame is catching. The world is listening to the bell. There's a new sound in the abbey. Not the clang of the main bell, it still tolls on cue, as dependable as ever, but something lighter, more musical. A second chime tucked discreetly within the scriptorium rings out every hour with a crisp ting. It's a tiny brass bell attached to a smaller version of the master clock. Compact, elegant, and just loud enough to remind Brother Hugo that it's time to stretch his hands before the ink starts to run sideways. This little addition is a marvel. Not just because it works, but because you helped build it. That's right. You are one sleepy novice who nearly set your cell on fire with a candle clock. Now understand the inner workings of a mechanical timepiece well enough to adjust gears, file axles, and even apply a bit of animal fat to reduce friction. You've joined Brother Conrad in the sacred tinkerer's circle, where monks whisper reverently about balance wheels and counterweights instead of saints and relics. Your abbey, once reliant on instinct and sunbeams, now hums with a quiet kind of precision engineering. And what's more miraculous, the abbot is fully on board. He started encouraging monks to design auxiliary clocks for different corners of the abbey, one near the herb garden to time watering and plucking cycles, another near the novices' dormitory for scheduled study breaks, and a third in the kitchen to monitor the temperamental barley stew. Each clock is slightly different. Each serves a purpose. Each is handcrafted by men of prayer, not of profit. This isn't just timekeeping, it's ritual architecture, sacred scheduling, devotion by design. And something else is happening too, something unexpected. The clocks are starting to shape behavior. Brother Ambrose, the most absent-minded monk in the entire abbey, now arrives to matins on time. Every time. Why? Because the small clock near his bed gives him a 15-minute warning bell. Brother Leo, who once overbaked everything, now checks the kitchen clock before every loaf. Even Brother Felix, grumpy, late-rising, skeptical of all things mechanical, has been spotted glancing up at the garden bell before trimming the rosemary. The clocks, once seen as novelties or necessary evils, have become something deeper, trusted companions. You find it strangely comforting. Time has always ruled monastic life, but it used to feel like a shifting burden, an obligation you could never quite fulfill. Now it feels like a current, steady, guiding, reliable, but it's not all harmony and gears. As the abbey becomes more mechanized, a few monks begin to raise theological questions. They wonder aloud if relying so heavily on machines might diminish the spiritual nature of the hours. Should we not rise because the Holy Spirit stirs our hearts, rather than a cogwheel one asks during chapter? The abbot considers this carefully. He's not dismissive, never is, but his answer is as calm as it is curious. We did not build the clock to replace the Spirit, he says. We built it to honor the Spirit's schedule. The machine rings the bell. We decide what it means. The room falls quiet. Even Brother Felix just nods. That's the thing about this period of monastic timekeeping. It's not about domination. It's about devotion. The clocks don't command. They remind. And in doing so, they allow for deeper intention, not less. Still, the machines need maintenance. Every few days, you and Brother Conrad climb the narrow tower steps to inspect the main clock. It's becoming your favorite ritual. Up there above the dormitory roofs, the wind moves differently. You can hear the countryside hum, birdsong livestock, the distant splash of the mill stream. Inside the wooden chamber, the gears tick away. Dust collects. Weights descend. Everything is motion and stillness at once. You wind the main weight slowly, carefully. Brother Conrad oils the escapement. You both lean in, listening for irregularities like doctors checking a heartbeat. Still steady, he murmurs. You smile. This tower has become more than a mechanical hub. It's a sacred space. Not because it's holy in the traditional sense, but because it holds the rhythm of your lives. Every click of the gear is a whispered prayer. Every chime a pause for reflection. Historians still argue whether monks like you understood what you were inventing. Did you realize that these simple timepieces would go on to shape cities, workplaces, entire civilizations? Probably not. But you felt it, this shift, this quiet revolution. Because here's the secret. The mechanical clock didn't make the abbey more efficient. It made it more attuned. Time wasn't just passing. It was being noticed, acknowledged, welcomed. Now you return to your duties with fresh perspective. When the small bell near the scriptorium rings again, you don't roll your eyes or sigh. You smile. You close your book. You stand and stretch because you know that sound. You helped build it. The seasons change. You hardly notice at first. So precise has life become that the drifting of leaves or the extra sting in the morning air feels more like background music than a shift in rhythm. But eventually, autumn settles over the abbey with that quiet insistence only nature can command. The garden's yellow, the wind creeps into your robe sleeves, and the early morning bells now ring out into mist instead of light. And yet nothing else changes, because for the first time in living memory, the time remains constant, even when nature doesn't. Before the clock tower, dawn determined your schedule. If the sun rose late, so did Lord's. If a storm covered the sky for 3 days, prayers drifted like scattered manuscripts. But now, with your gears and bells and quietly ticking towers, the abbey moves forward in measured cadence. Daylight may shrink, temperatures may fall, but prime is still prime. Sext still chimes when the sun is barely high. And that constancy, it's kind of magical. You notice how the newer novices take it for granted. They arrive for Mass with the calm assurance that the bell will ring exactly when it should. They don't hover by windows or peek out doorways to gauge the hour. They don't fear oversleeping and missing a chant. Time has been tamed, or at least domesticated, but you remember when it wasn't. You remember checking shadows on the wall, whispering to the stars, to guess how much time you had left to nap. You remember your first candle clock, the wax dripping sideways, because you placed it near a draft. You remember Jeffrey's stumbles, the emergency bell ringing during a thunderstorm when he slipped and took half the bell rope with him. And now, you're maintaining a miniature escapement in the dormitory hallway. You're oiling wooden wheels with sheep fat-based lubricant. You're training a younger monk, Brother Julian, who once tried to time terse with a sundial in a snowstorm, on how to recalibrate a slack tension weight. Your abbey doesn't just use time, it teaches it. there's a growing philosophy among the elders, not just about keeping time, but about living with time. A deeper awareness. Brother Hugo describes it as wearing time like a second robe. You begin to understand what he means. It's in the way you pace your breath during chants, how you anticipate the bell a few heartbeats before it tolls, how in the absence of any visible clock, your body seems to know where in the hour you are, but there are tensions too. Some monks, especially visiting ones from less developed abbeys, see the system as indulgent. All this machinery, one grumbles, and for what bells, that ring when no one listens. He's not entirely wrong. On stormy days, the bells ring into emptiness, the sound swallowed by fog or wind. On feast days, the entire system pauses for revelry, candles burning down while the clocks go unwound. But the argument never gets very far, because even the skeptics can't deny the way the abbey feels now. There's a peace that hums beneath the gears, a comfort in regularity, a kind of ambient holiness that rises not from thunderous choirs or glowing relics, but from the simple fact that time for once feels steady. Historians still debate whether the clock mechanized the sacred or sacralized the mechanical. Did monks surrender spiritual flexibility for mechanical reliability? Or did they elevate tools into instruments of devotion? You don't argue about it, you just live it, and you start to wonder if this is what the rule of St. Benedict truly envisioned. Not a rigid schedule out of fear, but a rhythmic one out of love. A daily dance with time, where you know your steps, your turns, your pauses, where every chime is a partner's hand, guiding you gently to the next motion. One afternoon, you find yourself alone in the bell tower. The wind whistles softly through the slats. The mechanism ticks. You close your eyes. Tick, tock, tick. And in that moment, half breath, half silence, you feel time, not as a burden, but as a prayer. Snow arrives without ceremony. One morning, you wake to find the world outside your cell window glazed white. The stone courtyard padded with hush, every roofline traced with the thinnest icing of silence. The garden paths disappear under powder. The fountain's lip has frozen. Even the birds seem to have abandoned their complaints, but the bell still rings. That's what hits you most. How time, now mechanized, no longer bows to the weather. Once snow would delay everything. The bell ringer would wrestle with frozen ropes. Candles wouldn't stay lit. Monks would misjudge the hour by cloudy sky and slippered guesswork. Now, no matter the frost or flurry, the clock ticks. Inside the abbey, life adjusts. The scriptorium feels chillier, breath fogs in the cloisters, and Brother Felix starts wearing 3 robes stacked like winter armor. But the schedule doesn't bend. Lord's rings when it must. Prime arrives whether you're ready or not. The divine hours remain framed not by sun or wind, but by gears turning faithfully in the cold. And then it happens something strange. One morning, the main bell fails to ring. At first, no one notices. It's early after all. But when terce comes, and there's still no sound from the tower, murmurs ripple through the dormitories like wind through rushes. You're sent to investigate, climbing the tower steps with a lantern in hand. Your fingers numb even before you reach the top. You find the problem almost immediately. The main weight is jammed. The rope has frozen stiff around the pulley, and the gears have seized with a crust of frost so fine it looks like spun glass. The entire mechanism sits still, like a bird holding its breath. For the first time in months, the abbey is without its heartbeat. You and Brother Conrad spend the next few hours thawing the gears with coals and whispered prayers. You wrap the pulleys in wool. You coat the teeth with warm oil. Slowly, the rhythm returns. Click, click, click. The first bell toll is faint, but unmistakably alive. The monks cheer. Well, as much as monks ever cheer, there's a dignified and some faint clapping. But this glitch sparks a discussion. If the machine can fail, does it make the routine more fragile or more human? Because here's the truth. Machines might offer precision, but they still live in the real world. They freeze, they rust, they break. And in that way, they mirror you. Your body gets sore. Your mind gets cloudy. Your spirit sometimes falters. But like the clock, with attention and care, you recover. And maybe that's the lesson. That mechanized time doesn't make you invincible. It just gives you structure, something to lean against when the snow drifts deep and your prayers feel like whispers in an empty chapel. Historians still argue whether the abbeys that embraced the clock first were the ones that thrived or the ones that grew rigid. Whether timekeeping gave monks freedom or tethered them to tyranny in tiny increments. But standing in the tower now, with steam rising from the thawed weight and the bell rope warming in your hands, you feel something else. Gratitude, not for the machine itself, but for what it allows space to breathe, to chant, to work, and rest in rhythm with something steadier than your own thoughts. You descend the tower slowly. Below, the courtyard glows with soft white light. The other monks have already returned to their duties. The kitchen smells of spiced broth. Somewhere in the scriptorium, you hear the scratch of quills against parchment, measured careful in time with the clock's tick. Everything has resumed, but now you all move forward with a fresh humility. Even your greatest invention, the gear and bell miracle, can fail. And so you tend it more gently, wind it more mindfully. Treat its tick as something sacred, not just useful. And when the bell rings again at sext, it sounds different, not louder, not softer, just more alive. You've begun to dream in clockwork, not numbers or ticking hands. Those are for merchants and mathematicians. Your dreams are more abstract, the slow swing of a pendulum beneath vaulted ceilings, brass gears blooming like flowers, bell tones layered over distant chanting. It's oddly peaceful. In your sleep, time unfolds like a liturgy, and when you wake always now just before the bell, you feel aligned with it all. The monks start calling it the inner ring, that subtle moment when your breath matches the pause between ticks, when your thoughts slow to the pace of the abbey. It's not something you aim for. It just arrives, like grace, like muscle memory, like sleep. The clock has become more than a timekeeper. It's a presence. It's in the way novices whisper before lords, glancing at the tower, like it might be listening. It's in how Brother Hugo taps his pen in time with the ticking, subconsciously anchoring his illuminated lines. It's in the way meals feel more sacred, not because the food's any better, it's not, but because the bell that calls you to the table does so with such quiet authority. One afternoon, you accompany Brother Conrad into the village. Word of your abbey's clock has spread farther than you realized. Locals want one. Not nobles, not tradesmen, just regular folks. The tanner's apprentice, the baker's wife, even the old widow who once called all machines little devils in boxes. They've all gathered to ask questions. How does it know the hour a child asks, eyes round as turnips? Brother Conrad smiles, then pulls from his satchel a small wooden model. It's crude, but functional. He winds it once, lets the escapement clatter, and the crowd gasps when the tiny hammer taps the bell. They don't know how it works, he says quietly, turning to you later. But they know how they feel when it works. That evening, you help install a simple bell timer in the village chapel. It's not much, just a hanging weight and a wooden drum, but it rings precisely at dusk. The vicar, who's been notoriously lax with his evening prayers, blushes when it chimes mid-conversation. Back at the abbey, something new awaits. Brother Julian has constructed what might be the most ambitious device yet, a calendar wheel. It's connected to the bell tower mechanism by a long rod made of ashwood and iron, delicate but sturdy. The wheel rotates once every 24 hours, nudging a painted pointer toward a sequence of holy days. No more scrambling through parchments to see if tomorrow is a feast day. Now it's displayed in wood and brass, rotating gently under the clock's watchful rhythm. You stare at it, marveling not just at its craft, but at the thought behind it. The clock no longer marks just the hour. It marks the season, the rhythm of years, the cycles of worship. Time in all its forms is being brought within reach. Historians still argue whether monastic clocks were the seeds of modern bureaucracy or the last bastion of spiritual time. Whether the gears were the beginning of soul-crushing schedules or the first tools of intentional living. But for you standing now before the calendar wheel, it feels like neither. It feels like a compass, a way of aligning your internal world with something steady, sacred, and real. And the Abbey responds. The community grows tighter. Chants begin with harmonies instead of coughing. Tasks are completed without reminders. Even Brother Felix has developed a sort of grudging admiration for the machine. He now nods solemnly at it whenever it chimes, as if acknowledging an equal. But something else stirs in you, an awareness that time once tamed can also spread. You imagine other abbeys installing their own bells, other towns syncing to their rhythm, a whole region perhaps moving not just in shared faith, but in shared timing. Not control, but coordination. It's a little terrifying and a little beautiful. The bell rings for Compline. You bow your head, your breath already slowing your body, already preparing for sleep. The stars are clear tonight. The sky feels wide and still. You whisper your last prayer beneath the chime. Teach me to number my days, not just to count them, but to live them. The Abbey receives a letter. A real one, wax-sealed, hand-delivered by a rider, wrapped in wool and dust bearing a crest none of you recognize. It's addressed to the abbot, of course, but word spreads fast, as it always does in places where silence is sacred, and gossip must travel quietly. The contents: a request. A nearby priory, modest and aging, once helped building its own mechanical clock. They've heard tales not of gold or relics or miracles, but of reliability, of monks who pray together on time, of crops sown with precision, of an abbey that seems in sync with something larger than itself. They want what you have, and so begins your abbey's new chapter, not as inventors, but as teachers. You, of course, are chosen to accompany Brother Conrad. You're still young, nimble-fingered, and according to the abbot, just technical enough to fix things, and just patient enough not to throw them. High praise by monastic standards. The journey is slow. Icy roads creaking cart sheep, with no respect for pathways. But after 3 days you arrive at the priory. It's smaller than you imagined, barely 24 monks, most well past their prime. The bell they use now is hand-wrung, cracked, and older than their herb garden. You set to work. There's no tower here, just a modest frame above the chapel gable. So the new clock is designed to be compact, durable, and simple. You explain the escapement mechanism, the drive weight, the gear ratios. Brother Conrad builds. You fine-tune. The priory's cook brings you questionable stews and stale rye bread, which you eat with grateful politeness and secret dread. But the work progresses. Slowly, the clock takes shape. A modest drum of polished oak fitted with brass teeth and a small hammer. The bell it strikes is no louder than a ladle on a pot, but it works. The first time it rings, the priory's entire congregation turns toward it like startled sheep. One of the older monks actually starts weeping. Haven't heard the hour on time in 20 years, he says, voice trembling. It moves something in you. Back at your own abbey, you'd begun to forget how profound this was. You'd normalized it. But here, watching grown men marvel at a sound you now take for granted, you realize the depth of the gift. This isn't about the gear or the chime. It's about shared rhythm. The monks begin to adjust. Their prayers grow steadier. Meals less chaotic. Even their smiles come easier. One morning you overhear a novice say, "The bell's ringing, we better hurry." And you grin, not because of the words, but because of the familiarity. The bell has started shaping their world. Before you leave, the prior thanks you with 2 small gifts, a pouch of preserved figs and a wooden carving of St. Benedict, awkwardly shaped but clearly heartfelt. You accept, both bowing lower than needed. Time is different here now, he says quietly. It feels like it belongs to us again. On the road home, you and Brother Conrad barely speak. Not out of fatigue, but because some silences are too full to break. When you return, the abbey is unchanged. The main bell still tolls. The novices still scurry. Brother Felix still mutters. But you see it all differently now. The rhythm you've built, the schedule you've embodied, it's spreading. Historians later describe this as the clock's great migration. From abbey to priory, from cathedral to town square, from sacred to secular. But they miss the smaller moments. The faces in that humble priory. The soft gasp when the bell rang on time. The fig-stained hands clutching at the rope with reverence. You were there. You saw how time, when gently held, becomes not a cage but a comfort. And you realize something: you're no longer just living in time. You're shaping it for others. You don't feel younger, but you do feel steadier. Years have passed, not in sudden leaps, but in the smooth turning of gears in bells, rung cleanly on cold mornings in ink, dried between quiet syllables. The abbey hasn't changed dramatically. No grand renovations, no firework epiphanies, just an ever-deepening sense of rhythm. Like a song you've been humming so long you no longer realize it has a tune. The mechanical clock still ticks in the tower. You still check on it weekly, winding the weights, cleaning the gears, muttering soft apologies when you knock something loose. You've trained 3 others now: Brother Julian, Brother Adam, and a reluctant but shockingly gifted Brother Felix, who together form a sort of informal guild of timekeepers. You jokingly call yourselves the Brotherhood of the Bell, though only Brother Julian finds that funny. But today something's different. It begins in the scriptorium. A visiting monk from a distant abbey, a towering man with soot-streaked robes and eyes like thunderclouds, arrives with a scroll tucked under one arm. He's heard of your gentle time bells and wants to consult you on a bold idea. He wants to build a public clock, not in a chapel, not in a cloister, but in the town square of a nearby city where merchants shout dogs bark and no one has ever kept regular hours in their lives. He imagines it striking every quarter hour, not just for monks or priests, but for blacksmiths, brewers and bakers. You sit with him in the refectory, fig bread between you, and he sketches it out with wine-dark ink, a large wheel driven by falling stones with interchangeable gear teeth to account for variable seasons. The bells would not just ring, they'd mark the world itself. You're stunned and intrigued and wary. Brother Conrad, now older and slower, but still sharp, listens carefully and then says, "This would be the first time we let the world live by our rhythm instead of the other way around." It's a big thought, bigger than the abbey walls. Until now, clocks have served the monastic order, helped align you with your vows. But what happens when the world adopts your tools, when people begin to structure lives? Not around sunrise and instinct, but around a mechanical tick they don't fully understand. Some monks worry. People are not gears, one mutters. You can't turn the city into a cloister. But others are curious. Maybe time, says Brother Hugo quietly, is sacred enough to share. Historians later call this era the secularization of time. The moment when clocks leave sacred spaces and enter town halls. When time becomes public. When bells no longer toll for prayers but for commerce appointments and eventually meetings about meetings. But in this moment, you're just watching a stranger draw circles on a parchment, dreaming of gears big enough to move a city. The abbot gives his cautious blessing. If we do this, he says, we must do it well. Let the bells still sound like a hymn. You agree to help. The next weeks blur. You build models, draft plans, experiment with new materials, bronze, oak, even imported tin. The town's masons visit. Merchants drop off food donations laced with very pointed questions like, will it ring in the market, and can it chime louder than goats? The final design is elegant. A double strike system. One bell for the hour, one for the quarter. A decorative sun-shaped face. A tiny inscription in Latin at the base, Tempus Donum Est. Time is a gift. Installation day draws a crowd. Children press against shop windows. Dogs bark at the scaffolding. A bishop offers a speech that's half prayer, half political calculus. And then the weight is released. The first strike rings out, clear, bold, measured. Then again, a quarter past. No one moves. Then slowly, astonishingly, merchants begin calling out prices on the quarter. Bakers shout 5 minutes more like prophets. A woman scolds her husband for being late for the first time in 30 years. It's working. The bell born in your abbey's cold tower now anchors the heartbeat of a town. You return home with quiet awe, because this is more than a mechanism. It's more than scheduling. It's the idea that time, when honored, can be shared. That sacred rhythms aren't just for cloisters. They can shape fields, marketplaces, laughter, lives. The abbey feels quieter now, but only by contrast. The bells still ring, but you know now they echo farther than you thought. You've grown older. It's subtle, felt first in the knees, when climbing the tower steps, or the way your fingers hesitate a heartbeat longer before threading wire through a pulley. But it's there. The years have passed, wound tightly into each tick of the clock you helped build, echoing through 1,000 prayers, 1,000 quiet moments of breath held between bells. The abbey still stands, still hums with purpose. The clock still ticks, but something has shifted, not in the mechanism, but in you. You now find yourself watching more than doing, training the younger monks instead of climbing the tower yourself, sitting beside Brother Julian as he balances the weight of the escapement, offering only small corrections, observing Brother Felix. Yes, Felix, calibrate the quarter chime with the same gruff precision he once used to scold anyone caught whistling before matins. And that's okay, because now you see it all with wider eyes. The rhythm you once fought to understand has become second nature. The bells no longer surprise you. You feel them coming. You breathe in time. You are time. You begin keeping a journal, not for glory or record, but for peace. You write down moments: the day the garden bell got stuck in a snowstorm, the morning the kitchen clock chimed early and confused everyone into eating porridge at sunrise, the first time Brother Hugo fell asleep. After Compline, and everyone let him. And then one day, the abbot asks you a question. What do we leave behind? Not relics. Not relic hunting, at least. Not gold or bones. Not scrolls, though the scriptorium is full. He means what remains of you once your hands are still. You don't answer immediately. You let the question hang soft as incense drifting through the vaulted air. Later, alone in the clock tower, you wind the great weight one last time. You move slowly, respectfully, like visiting a sleeping friend. The gears creak, then catch. The pendulum swings. The ticking resumes. And there, standing in the golden hush of evening, you realize something simple. You're not leaving behind a clock. You're leaving behind a rhythm. The rhythm of rising when you don't want to. Of praying when your thoughts are elsewhere. Of tending something that will never say thank you. Of measuring your life not in big moments, but in repeated, quiet acts of care. You've helped mark time not as a master, but as a companion. Historians still debate whether the monks who built the first clocks knew what they were unleashing. Some say they chained us to minutes and hours. Others say they gave us the freedom to live with intention. You think they did neither. They simply listened to a deeper silence, the kind between chants, between thoughts, between breaths, and tried to build something that could hold it. You step out of the tower, the dusk cool on your face. A distant bell chimes. Not your bell, not anymore, but it still sings the same song. You smile, because you know someone else will climb those stairs tomorrow. Someone else will wind the weight. Someone else will listen, and the rhythm will go on. And now, dear listener, it's time to let the final echoes fade. The bells have done their part. The gears have turned. The candles have flickered low across stone floors, and the abbey has returned to stillness. You've walked the halls, climbed the tower, listened to the tick, the chime, the hush in between. You've lived an entire lifetime in the rhythm of another age, a time when waking was sacred and every hour had a name. When monks mark their days not by ambition or urgency, but by devotion, repetition, and quiet care, let that sense of rhythm linger with you now. Breathe in deeply. Let your own pulse slow. Let your mind soften. Picture the sky above the cloister, the distant hills bathed in moonlight, the faint sound of one last bell as it drifts across the snow-dusted courtyard. You are not behind. You are not late. You are exactly where you are meant to be. No need to think about tomorrow. It will chime soon enough. For now, rest in the steady quiet. The hour is full. The moment is enough. Sleep well, time traveler.